Good morning, everyone, and for joining our SCTG webinar this morning or afternoon, depending on your coastal orientation. This is Anthony Raj speaking from the Educational and Community Supports Unit at the University of Oregon. It is my pleasure to be hosting this informative webinar titled The Best Practices in the Classroom, Building Capacity at District Level to Support Your Teachers, presented by Kimberly Yannick and Susan Barrett. Susan Barrett and Dr. Kimberly Yannick serve as Director and Co-Director of the Mid-Atlantic PBIS Network at Shepherd Pratt Health System in Baltimore, Maryland. Shepherd Pratt Health System is working with the OSEP Technical Assistance Center on PBIS as the implementer partner. Kim and Susan assist with large-scale implementation of statewide PBS by providing training and technical assistance to states and districts across the country. I know you're all excited to be here, and I'd like to encourage all of you to take notes, ask questions in the Q&A chat box. Just a quick reminder that if you are dialing into this conference, to please mute your phone via the *6 key combo. With that, I'll hand over the reins to Kimberly and Susan.
Thank you, Anthony. Hi, everyone. This is Susan Barrett, and Kim and I are really excited to be with you this afternoon or morning, again, depending on where you are. And we would love to hear from you as we go through the webinar today. We do have some polling questions a little later on in the broadcast, and we would also love if you have questions to put them in the chat box. And also at the end of the session, you'll have an opportunity to be unmuted and ask questions verbally. So with that, let's get started. As Anthony said, we are going to focus on classroom systems today. And I don't think we could have had this webinar if it weren't for all of the help and support and work that has really been accomplished by our partners. We truly have a national community of practice, and we just want to say thank you for all the contributions made by our partners. So just to kind of get us oriented about what we're going to cover today, we want to really explore the alignment of outcomes, data, practices, and systems to support the capacity building across the cascade of implementation. It's going to be really important that we identify the ways we shape behavior from the national level to the classroom level, and to make sure that the kids are experiencing best practices in the classroom. And it really takes all of us across that cascade to make that happen. So we're going to be exploring ways that we can support that. We also want to explore data-informed decision-making. How do we know what to do to support teachers in the classroom? How do we take data? How do we use data? How do we analyze that and really transform it into day-to-day application of those best practices? And then lastly, we're going to talk throughout this hour about the new positive classroom behavior support technical briefs that have been excuse me, that have been recently developed by our National Technical Assistance Center. And we'll be providing examples on some of the application efforts that we're using to launch from those technical briefs. So you're going to see this slide a lot. We really want to build off our talk today using and anchoring our big messages using this graphic. And hopefully you're familiar with this graphic and you've been utilizing it across your implementation efforts with PBIS or MTSS. A couple of things I just want to highlight as we're going through this. Part of why we all love PBIS or MTSS is the flexibility of the model, right? It's a framework that's guided by specific data sets from your school and your school community that informs the way we work and operate. And so part of the beauty is this personalized, customized approach that's built on your school's needs. So we always want to start when we're thinking about installing an innovation. We want to think about what the equitable outcomes will be. What is it at the end of our work or throughout our work? What will we see in terms of impact on our kids, for our kids? And how do we really use that data to lean in to figure out what to do first and how to prioritize our efforts? So we're going to focus on those data pieces. What data do we need to collect? How do we progress monitor fidelity of implementation? How do we make sure that we are giving teachers performance feedback data sets that inform practice at the classroom level? As we move into the blue circle, thinking about practices, what is the what? What are those practices? Have we done a good job of teaching all of our teachers the basic foundation principles of classroom management, behavior science, and what are those practices that everybody needs to be installing across every classroom in our school? And then finally, in the green circle, we want to think about what we're going to do for the adults. How do we set up those professional learning communities? How do we make sure that all of our teachers are actively involved in getting better at their jobs? And how do we set the table for that to happen within the host environment at the school level and the district level? So what do we do to support adults to implement best practices? Again, thinking about those classroom systems. So as we kind of lean into this, we're going to set up the first poll question. We'd love to hear from you about where you fit in the cascade of support. So are you working at the federal level to support implementation of PBIS, maybe through work that's associated with the TA Center, the School Climate Transformation Grant work, or Project Aware? Are you working at the state level to provide leadership and guidance? Are you working at the district level or perhaps the building level? Are you a building staff? Are you a classroom teacher? And finally, maybe a family member or perhaps a student on the line. So we've opened up the polling process, and if you could select where you fall in the cascade, that will give us a good idea of who we have on the call today. Anthony, are you setting that up for us so folks can select? Okay, I see that. Okay, so it looks like a lot of you are working both at the state and the district level. Great, that really helps us with our setup for today. So thank you. We could end that poll. So as we think about the classroom systems in the context of the public health approach, you guys are also really familiar with the triangle, right? And the logic of supporting and building capacity throughout the continuum. And most of the time we think of the continuum and support with our students. And in this case, we really want to kind of consider how we're using that same logic and applying it to our schools and applying it to our staff. And how do we sort our schools by what it is they need and really hone in, again, on those specific data points that inform us about how to enhance implementation, maybe around equity for a small number of schools, or how do we enhance implementation with a small number of classroom teachers who might be struggling? How do we use all that data, and then how do we use this logic and apply that as we build the cascade? So this, again, informs that common way of work and that lens and thinking about implementation, not only through the cascade, but also throughout the tiers. So let's come back to this graphic. Again, I told you we would see this a lot during this PowerPoint. This is really our problem-solving approach. And we're going to start to think about considerations for alignment as we dive into the what. So let's focus first on those practices, that blue circle of practices. One of the things you might want to start to do, and hopefully you've done this before in some of your trainings, is something called resource mapping. And this is an activity that allows you to take an inventory of the current initiatives that are taking place in your school around classroom systems. So are there PD sessions that are available across the district that already exist? Is there a new teacher orientation that might exist? Is there a scope and sequence, and maybe getting out that master calendar and kind of figuring out what already exists in terms of initiatives that are specifically designed around classroom management. Because the last thing we want to do is add one more thing without considering what's already happening and occurring and figuring out how well those things are working and how best to kind of approach putting structures around those practices. So the first thing that you might want to do is just kind of think about district-wide, what are the available resources we have around classroom management, what's already in place, what's effective and what's not. And so this kind of takes you through that process. So we've got maybe, again, exploring that PD schedule, thinking about having the time and space not only to get access to the training, but how technical assistance is provided. Oftentimes we see a lot of trainings on the calendar, but we don't oftentimes think about the allocation of time that's really necessary to provide the type of technical assistance that's needed to apply that new knowledge. So a lot of what we're talking about with our trainers across the country right now is to consider using that same kind of logic that we apply for feedback ratios. Remember that 5-to-1 kind of feedback ratio? We're suggesting to our trainers that you spend five times the time spent on technical assistance than on training, so that we're not just giving out knowledge, we're actually following through and building those professional learning communities to ensure that teachers are utilizing that newfound knowledge and applying it every single day in their classroom. So using that logic has been really helpful by way of thinking about technical assistance and training and how they go hand in hand, but really thinking about 5 to 10 times more frequently we should be delivering technical assistance than we should be training. And then finally, taking a look at your teaming structures. What are the grade level teams? What are the teams that exist in the school that can have kind of a serve as a coaching unit to make sure that these things are getting implemented? So what is your why? How would you go about aligning the data, systems, and practices to support your work and build out that fluency and capacity building with best practices inside your schools? And we've got some forced choice here for the poll in terms of having you kind of let us know what your major why is and how that's influencing how you're moving through classroom systems. So we've got, are you interested in supporting implementation? Are you trying to align a common way of work and really use this logic to apply at the classroom level? Are you supporting data-informed and decision-making work? Are you trying to make sure that classroom systems isn't that kind of one-off and outside the realm of PBIS? Sometimes we think of classroom systems down the road after we've installed Tier 1, and we know that PBIS really isn't in place unless you've got classroom systems right there at the go as we're implementing and installing Tier 1. So what is your big why? I'm looking at the responses. It looks like really the data-informed piece and supporting implementation of these practices. Okay. Wonderful. Thank you. So let's take another look at the circles again and think about it in a problem-solving context. And we've given you a specific example to work with. So as we're installing classroom supports in the framework of PBIS, step one is really, what does the data say? What is your most significant concern as it relates to classroom systems? Is it maybe that your teachers may not even be aware of some of the basic 8 classroom components? Your data that you're getting from Swiss or other applications should be able to give you a precision statement about what your major concern areas are. And you could also do some, during a staff meeting or professional learning community meeting, you could also take the time and kind of ask what's been most frustrating. You know, sometimes it feels like Groundhog Day every day as teachers move throughout the school year. And so really kind of unpack what is going on in those classrooms. Step 2 will be establishing a SMART goal. So at the end of a training event or series of training events, and after you've established some data markers, What do you expect to have happen as a result? Do you expect referral patterns to go down? Do you expect attendance rates to kind of increase? Do you expect classwork to increase? What is that attainable, realistic, time-bound goal that you're going for? Step 3 will be to ask yourself what we're going to actually do inside those classrooms to support the types of behavior. Remember, we're always going to go for promoting and preventing first. So as you see the 8 classroom components unfolded in a couple of minutes, you're going to see that most of what we should be focused on is prevention first. And then we move into when behaviors do occur, because we know they will, how do we teach replacement skills? Where is the time and space, and how are we going to do that? And how are we going to make sure that we're going to support utilization of those replacement skills? And then finally, step 4, how do we teach the staff the necessary skills? How do we keep coming back to this using data, making sure we've got performance feedback data ready at the go so that we can inform practice and inform how we boost some of those activities around supporting the classroom teacher. So we're going to keep coming back to this problem-solving logic and these 4 steps constantly. This is a fluid process. You're never going to be completely finished. Your data should always be helping you enhance that work and boosting up the behaviors for the adults so that we see that benefit to our kids. Okay, so I think you've had enough of the circles. So let's start. I'm hoping that you guys have all downloaded the PBI on PBIS.org, the technical brief. This is that new brief that I was referring to. And if you were at the School Climate Transformation pre-conference session in Chicago a couple of weeks ago, you may have heard Brandy Simonson talk about the way that it's organized. So we're going to piggyback on that talk and also provide some specific examples related to maybe how to use this in the future. You also have access, and hopefully you know about the tiered fidelity inventory, the school-wide PBIS TFI, and you've been using that to track fidelity of implementation across the tiers in your schools, and you're using that data to inform how you boost specific training events and how you position your technical assistance to fit the needs of the schools that might be struggling in specific areas. And you know about the 8 classroom practices. One of the things that we have done, and here are the 8 classroom behavioral support practices. These are our basics that we start with. One of the things that we've done with our professional learning map and the way we've approached training is that we've infused all of these practices, or most of these practices, into our Tier 1 professional learning roadmap. So we've modularized in our 2-day sessions, we modularize each of the components of the TFI. And as teams go through this, when we touch upon behavior expectations, we're going to roll right into what that looks like and sounds like at the classroom so that teams are really clear that, yes, we're going to be talking about the importance of setting up school-wide behavior expectations, but we want it to connect to what's going on in the classroom. And so we're going to ask the team to carefully install that right alongside Tier 1. So we've infused and incorporated defining, teaching, acknowledging rules and expectations, routines, employing active supervision, and providing specific praise for behavior, and that continuum of response into Tier 1 implementation. And we put that at the forefront to make sure that that occurs. Okay, so that was quick to go through those practices. I'm going to turn it over to Kim, who's going to start to talk about the systems and the data. And we had a little bit of a challenge separating those 2 pieces out because they really go hand in hand. So I think we're going to talk about them at the same time. So I will turn it over to Kim.
So Susan, and it's hard to tease any of them out, but it was especially hard to tease out systems and data. So we're going to look at those 2 together and some of the work we've been doing around that. Susan introduced the practice brief, the responding to problem behavior. This is a technical brief that has come out from PBIS.org as well, and it's around system support. So when you think about some of the readiness steps that Susan introduced us to, both at the district and the school level, this might be, along with the practice brief, these might be good resources to engage people in prior to a resource mapping experience, so they have an idea of thought process around what is currently going on in their districts and or schools. The other resource that's really valuable is there are 3 blueprints, as you know, available at PBIS.org. One of them is the professional development blueprint. And recently that's been revised to include, I believe it's in the appendix, a sample professional learning plan. And what that plan details is this hybrid approach to professional learning to support implementation at district, school, and classroom level. So it's a nice resource to kind of look at and see what are some possibilities, how might we plan for this ongoing professional learning, because we all know it's not a one and done approach to what we do. And the last resource I want to show you at this time is a resource that we uploaded that's in the notes section to the PBIS.org, the School Climate Transformation site. And that is just a sample of a district implementation plan for multiple schools. And what you'll see reflected in that plan is a 2-year process, really, this kind of spiraling curriculum, if you will, around the 8 practices that Susan introduced. And so when we look at organizing our resources for building a system of support for the adults, we spent time in our work introducing everyone, engaging everyone in all of these 8 practices. So you'll see that reflected in year 1. And then what you'll see reflected in year 2 are boosters, data-informed decisions to support either all, some, or a few of the staff. The other thing you're going to see reflected is a gradual release of responsibility that would indicate some capacity building effort. So in year 1, you'll see in the notes or the who did this, a lot of that came from our center at first as an external provider. And then gradually, we had this gradual release of responsibility where district coaches started taking on more of that. School administrators did that, the teams. And then you'll see at the end of year 2, towards the end of year 2, lead teachers from particular schools who demonstrated fluency with some of the practices, leading professional learning for the entire district for teachers. So there's lots of notes to kind of look for if you download that resource, and you can see that across 6 different schools, there's some different approaches, different timelines, and so forth. But it's everyone's moving in the same direction and making it contextually relevant for them. So Susan mentioned using the notion of the public health model, if you will, to organize our resources around building systems of support for the adults. And this is just a sample, and I'm going to go through this and give you some details, but just to kind of give you the balcony view, if you will, thinking about either at the state, district, or school level, what you might do for all staff or schools, whatever your unit of analysis is, districts, what you might do for some, and then what you might do for a few. So I would invite you to really consider using this public health model to begin to think about organizing this continuum of support for staff to support them to implement the practices. So alongside that, we want to also look at a continuum of assessment. So how do we engage everyone in this data-informed process? How do we use data to engage some? And again, how are we using data to inform and engage a few teachers or schools or districts? So just to take that big balcony view and start to dissect it a little bit, these are just some examples of some of the things that we've been experiencing and facilitating with schools and districts. And for all, that might be that we start with alignment. Again, Susan referenced resource mapping. Through the resource mapping exercise, you can identify not only what are the practices or approaches or initiatives that you have related to classroom management, if you will, specifically, but also how are those things supported? Are there coaches currently in a district? Are there people in different departments responsible for different pieces of classroom management? And how do we begin to put that all out there so we can begin to align those resources? And looking at the district strategic plan. So in one district we worked in, the school improvement plan was aligned with the district strategic plan, and they identified which goals specifically would inform classroom management, what school climate, classroom climate, and that's what they put in front of staff and anchored to. They also made sure that anything that teachers attended in terms of this ongoing support was included for recertification points. So they were really attaching value to this learning. And they also had, in some of the larger districts and the smaller districts that we worked with, there'd be a district team or district people who come in and do learning walks or site visits in schools. And so we've invited them to say, here are the 8 practices we're looking at, especially in a larger district with site-based management, where everybody might be doing something slightly different. We invited them to look at the practices we're working on so that we could start to push out that language and that consistency around practices. We also looked at using our Tier 1 team. Susan mentioned a core coaching unit, which might be administrators or team leads, and working with them a little bit in advance of team professional learning, where they can do some of this work around systems with resource mapping, teaming, structure alignment, and so forth. I'm going to go into a little bit more on the professional learning and the data informed in a moment. Acknowledging the staff, though, making sure, in our TFI, our BOQ, we actually have fidelity indicators around acknowledging and including staff. So creating an awareness for that to make sure we don't forget to do that. And contextually relevant to school culture. So I mentioned in the sample district plan that you're going to see that with our work, we started with modules, and there are lots of resources out there that you can access around these 8 and other classroom practices. But the schools, we would deliver that to a school team and district coaches, and they really looked at it to make it relevant to their school setting. Even within the same district, a high school reflection would be different than an elementary reflection of the materials that you engage people with for professional learning. The other thing that was important was messaging around this. So we're building this continuum of support for staff, and we didn't want to message it as a deficit approach. We really were very intentional with the language around our messaging and building this as a capacity building approach to what we're doing in our building to grow consistency and fluency with practices. So professional learning for all. Again, we found that using the Tier 1 team was very beneficial. From that, we found in our experience when the administrators, 1, 2, or more were part of that experience, what we got back from staff was that they knew it was important and they knew it was valued. And they said without that, they may have saw this as just one more thing, if you will. But having them part of that effort seemed to increase the value attached to it. And there's some natural resources in the building that are in classrooms, different coaches, school counselors, specialists, and they became part of this team. So when we reviewed our teaming structure alignment, we made sure when we were working on the classroom that those folks were part of that team as well, so they could go in and model because they're naturally in classrooms. And it was a great naturally occurring resource that we could access. Some of the schools we found were able to do scheduling with PD that really occurred during the course of the workday. So that really invites us to think about maybe professional learning a little differently. It doesn't necessarily need to be this traditional 30 minutes in a staff meeting after school, but thinking about how you can utilize the resources that are out there. A lot of our schools moved into flipped learning, so there's a video out there of this particular practice on any of the many websites, and teachers would use that. And when they came together, we had some one-pagers that we would engage them in around, here's the practice, here's the data part for assessment, and having them think about how they would build fluency around that practice. The other thing we did for all was non-evaluative learning walks. So again, as part of a capacity building approach, we partnered up as external folks with a district, with their coaches, or sometimes with team members. And we would go into classrooms and collect data just to formulate a snapshot in time of what we observed. No names attached to anything. It was just a snapshot. And the greater outcome of that was to develop inter-rater reliability. So we go in pairs and we take some data and then we debrief. What did you notice? And start to move towards some consistency with that. And eventually, after probably the second or third site visit, that capacity shifted. So we were no longer leading that effort. The district folks or the school folks were leading that for themselves. So I mentioned what another thing we did for all around data collection and sharing options was that we made it optional in terms of choice of how the data was to be collected. So we wanted everyone to collect data on fluency on these 8 practices. So we might do a PD session this month, and then for the next 4 weeks, we're all going to collect data. But what we found in different schools is the culture for people being in classrooms is very different. So having the team think about how they want to lean into this. In some schools, it was just offer self-observation and peer buddy and let teachers choose. So they used video or audio recordings of themselves, and then they took data on that, or they could invite someone that they trusted to come into their classroom and take data on that. Other schools, they're used to people being in their classroom, not a big deal, please come in. So coach or team members might come in and take data. Sometimes we only started with the team members in the process because of the culture and had them engage in that and share that experience out to the staff as part of the PD and how they might look at collecting data. So we always gave options for data collection on fluency, and then we also had some formal collections of data on fluency with observations in the classrooms. And equally as important, we made sure that we had different ways of sharing the data that we did collect with staff. So that might have been fluency of the implementation of those 8 practices. We collected anecdotal teacher data perception. So as a result of, focusing your feedback ratios on respect on Tuesdays and Thursdays from 1 to 3, because that's where we were seeing some spikes, what did you notice? And then sharing that data back with the staff. We use precision statements for classroom by grade level. We would share that with the grade level members, or we did share it with the entire staff, and I'll show you some examples of that in a moment. And of course, we use outcome data. So thinking about different ways to both collect and share the data, again, being very intentional with maintaining safety and transparency with this process is really important. So all staff were engaged with data-informed solution making. Again, we would formulate precision statements. Sometimes that was at a school-wide application because that was the best reflection of our current situation. But sometimes it was, we had, different precision statements by grade level. And we did include minor and major data for the most part. If schools were struggling with minor, then we might pull that out and just look at major first. But we used both of those data sources. And then we engaged them in, okay, so here's the precision statement. What do you notice? And what might we do in response to that? So we engaged them in the solution development, making sure we anchored right back to the 8 practices, which Susan kind of showed us. Here's what the current reality is with the data, and then what are the practices that we might choose in response to that, and how are we going to work together to build fluency. So I mentioned contextually relevant as part of what we did for all. And one of the things I mentioned already was messaging, making sure that you think about how to message this approach. And also you're going to see within this approach that there was a coaching component involved for very few teachers. So maybe from the beginning thinking about how are we going to build a culture of coaching so that we move from coach as a noun to coaching as a verb. The coaching may start with a few core people, but how do we create this process that's safe, that's engaging, that begins to become part of our culture where we have self-reflection and people coaching one another. And the other culturally relevant, another thing to think about is support versus evaluation. So there's a whole system for teacher evaluation, and we really want this to be a separate system. The practices may be the same, of course, they may be aligned, but we don't want this to become part of evaluation. We want it to be safe for people to ask for help and to engage in that process. So that's what we did for all, and what we did for some. We formed PLCs, professional learning communities, with focused support. And then we also had small group professional learning that was either the result of self-selected, so a teacher may have requested it, or it might have been data-informed. So here's an example of a data-informed decision that a Tier 1 team might look at. So I'll give you a minute to read that. So for those of you on the phone, we're looking at a precision statement that says for the first 2 months of school, staff report 60 incidents, office and classroom managed, of disrespect and disruption in the classroom, with 80% of the incidents occurring in 5th grade. So it was 4 out of 4 5th grade staff for 30 distinct students, with the majority of incidents occurring between 10 and 11:30 and 1:30 and 3:30, mostly on Tuesdays and Thursdays. Staff report that they are unsure as to why students might be engaging in this behavior. So if we use the rule of 10 to guide our problem solving and solution development around this, we looked at this just being specific to 5th grade. When we pulled in the other grade levels, we weren't seeing the same issues. So we took this precision statement and we shared it with 5th grade and just simply asked them, what do you notice? So what grabbed their attention was the time, and they know their schedule better than anyone else, so why not engage them with that solution development? But on Tuesdays and Thursdays, they thought about that, and what they identified was those are the days where we have more transitions between classrooms. And so we engaged them, well, what could we do to support that? And one of the teachers mentioned, well, 4th grade does the same thing. Are they having the same issues? Well, 4th grade had routines in place. They had high rates of feedback ratios around those routines. They taught them. So the administrator set up time for the 5th grade staff to go and watch the 4th grade during transition. Then they set up time for the 5th grade staff to meet with the 4th grade staff and help them with setting up routines and procedures and sharing things that they did. So they leveraged those internal resources to support fluency building. And that was just data informed. And we thought about, well, where is this working and how do we then replicate that process? So they developed their own plan with the support of another grade level. And then we progress monitored through the outcome data so we could go back to that precision statement to see if we move those data points, teacher feedback, and observation. So if we're thinking about the public health model, what could be done for a few? What we looked at was coaching with performance feedback and requests for support. And so again, using the Tier 1 team who's already looking at that school-wide data, here's an example of a precision statement. So for those of you on the phone, it says in the past 2 months, 3 language arts classrooms, 2nd, 4th, and 5th period, taught by the same teacher, have had a lot of disruptive behavior. 31 office referrals were given out across these 3 periods. 12 students had 2 or more ODRs. So we deemed that as an individual issue and proceeded to use that as a data-informed decision-making point for engaging that teacher, inviting them into a coaching partnership. Some other data-informed decisions, we also had teachers requesting classroom observations to provide feedback. So once they were convinced that this was safe and this was truly capacity building, they started reaching out to us. and the team and the coach, saying, could you come and watch my classroom and observe my classroom and give me some feedback? We also use data from progress monitoring on fluency, and we did this both to identify teachers in a small group who had just around the specific practice, and then teachers who, there's teachers that are really good at what they do, and they get all the students who provide them opportunities to grow patience during the year. So we wanted to make sure we came in and, if that was the case, offer them some additional support. The really unique experience that we had in some of our schools is when we implemented Tier 2, and we used check-in, check-out as our first evidence-based practice. The check-in, check-out coordinator, in reviewing the DPR, the Daily Progress Report data, for a couple of students, one case in particular, the student did really well. She saw patterns of the student meeting their goal in the morning, but not in the afternoon. So the check-in, check-out coordinator went to the Tier 1 lead and said, what do you make of this? And he says, well, let's go and observe. So they observed that the student had two teachers, one in the morning, one in the afternoon. And the morning teacher used high rates of performance feedback, pre-correction, a lot of preventative things. And the afternoon teacher, there was some possibility, some opportunity for growth there. So we brought them together with the check-in, check-out coordinator and the Tier 1 coach and worked with them to help them build fluency for that. So it was a really interesting experience that we didn't anticipate, but it was a good data source and people worked very collaboratively. So part of the resource mapping I mentioned to you is I would look at, when you resource map around the different approaches and instructional and classroom management, where is coaching occurring in your district? Or is there a specific coaching approach that your district has embraced? Think about that. It probably reflects some of these features you're seeing on your screen. And if it doesn't, here are some core features when you look across the literature on coaching. So either a data-informed request for assistance. We certainly don't want to impose this on anyone, but we want to build a culture of coaching where people feel safe to ask for help. Observation data then, so can we collect some observation data to share with the teacher, ask what they notice, and then help them identify an action plan for themselves, and they facilitate that. And we offer support in terms of modeling or peer observations, having them go and watch someone or watching videos that we've used, and then doing ongoing progress monitoring and feedback. So that the goal would be for that teacher to, we have a gradual release of support and their progress monitoring their own fluency, and then maybe they can become a coach for someone else as well. So we have used the coaching approach, and we've had to lean into that different ways in different schools and districts, depending on the culture of the building. In some buildings, the team engaged in this process, and one person would serve as the coach, and the other teacher would have that experience. In some buildings, we invited some of the teachers who were the leaders, who had really strong classroom management, to engage in this process first and help us work it out to be very reflective of the culture in our building. In some buildings, part of this was, once you go through this process, we'd like to invite you to be someone who could then go and replicate this process with others who might request or need a little bit more support. So again, thinking about the culture in which you're engaging your staff in, or your schools in, even with the coaching. So we've given you some examples of looking at alignment of data practice systems and outcomes, looking at using the public health model to organize resources so that we can be more efficient and effective, use data to inform what we're doing. So some key considerations to think about as you think about how you might begin this work is what we experience is we use the same data collection tools at all three tiers. So what we did for we all used the same observation tool for those 8 practices. What we did for some, we still use the same, whatever practices we were focusing on, whichever ones we were focusing on, those are the data tools we use, and the same for the few. And we use the same 8 practices for fluency to focus our fluency building across tiers. So some schools made posters. You notice there was a puzzle with 8 practices on there. They actually put those in everyone's classroom. So we all had awareness and this hyper focus on these 8 practices that we were working to build fluency with and using data to see how we were doing and where we needed to grow. And then support fluency building. Again, I can't emphasize enough of using the data and being very reflective of the culture in the school, the context in which you're looking to build these systems of support. So with the the link that's in the notes pod, you'll find a sample guidebook that really takes you through some of the work we've been experiencing with districts and schools around this alignment of data practices and systems. There are data collection tools in there. There are sample action plans around the 8 practices we're developing, spiraling professional development curriculum, if you will, and scope and sequence of how you might lay this out so it does allow for ongoing support and learning. Anything to add, Susan, before?
No, I think the just you guys understand your culture and your context in terms of how to lean into some of the dialogue and how to separate that out from the evaluation system. A little bit burned about that by the evaluation system, and we want to come in and make sure that we're doing this in the supportive context, knowing full well that many pre-service teachers aren't walking in the door with knowledge of kind of the basics of classroom management. We really have to be cautious and careful, and we really need the leadership at the district level and at the school level to understand that where teachers are, honor that, and then spend time building the systems to support it rather than developing a professional development calendar, right? We're just really worried that, we're losing 50% of our workforce every 5 years. And we, especially in the kind of climate that we find ourselves in, we need to be nurturing and supporting our teachers. And we've found some really good strategies, and hopefully we've learned about some really good strategies from the work that we've been developing over the last 5 years. And we've got some nice data sets too, and feedback from our schools and our districts to say that this has really been effective. With that, I think we're going to open it up for questions and think about how you might lean into this, where you might start, what's kind of circling around in your head that you want us to discuss a little bit more. The line is open. You can type in the Q&A box. You can type in the polling question. Love to hear from you if you're connecting with what we're describing. Hopefully we've given you a lot of resources and a lot of probably things to think about. Template that helps. Specifically. The 8 classroom strategy. Can you say a little bit more, or you're can unmute your line? And while you're doing that, yes, you have access to everything we have provided today. You have access to the guidebook. This PowerPoint is available. We have implementation snapshots that go over those 8 classroom components. We love that they are short, concise, 10-minute kind of fluency building pieces that really help hone in on one specific classroom management practice. And sometimes we do skill of the month, and all teachers will engage in that skill of the month, again, based on the data. Good. Glad to hear that it's affirming what you're doing. So keep doing what you're doing. I have to say the performance feedback data and our ability to provide technical assistance at the classroom level has been really informing the way we adapt our curriculum and the way we adapt our training. So I highly recommend that if you are a state or district trainer, to spend as much time as you can inside the classroom and inside your schools to help continue.
The leader has muted your line. To unmute your line, press #6.
I don't know what that was. Start by looking at the spreadsheet that maps out district. Okay, so somebody was helping us understand that question. Thank you very much. How do you start these conversations about teachers looking at their peers' classroom level data? Any strategies to initiate the conversation? Yeah, so I'll start and then Kim can chime in. One of the strategies we had was we put the 8 classroom components up on a slide during a slide presentation, put that slide up and asked, true or false, are these practices in place in 100% of your classrooms? And of course, when you ask administrators and you ask teachers if that's in place, everybody kind of, nods their head and says yes. And then we said, how do you know? Where's the data? And so how might we start collecting the data? And we started with feedback ratios. And we, again, made sure that we were leaning in very cautiously and carefully because this could have gone wrong really fast. But we asked them to record themselves for 10 minutes using their phones and take some data on their feedback ratios. And then the next time we met, it just sparked a lot of dialogue and conversation. Before we asked them to record themselves, we said, well, what do you think your feedback ratios are? We asked them to estimate. And then after they recorded themselves, it was a different story. And that just kind of opened the window for us to be able to have more dialogue around utilization of those classroom components. And then we made it really safe for them to invite somebody they were really comfortable with in the school to come in and take additional data. And I don't know if Kim has additional comments to make along that line, but we have these awesome phones, so might as well put them to good use, right? In terms of starting those conversations and dialogue. We've also done surveys where or focus groups with our teachers, looking at the data and asking them what they think about the data. But yeah, I agree. Starting with a pilot and expanding from there is always good. Making sure that while you're starting that pilot and starting small, making sure that you are having others in the district join you. So you're always having that capacity building lens, maybe fishbowling a little bit so that folks are understanding what it takes to make this happen, because I can't tell you the amount of technical assistance and coaching and support that's really needed in order really to have this come to fruition. Another question is around getting started as a first-year coach.
Well, we've done some of that work, and it just depends. So we have some coaches that we've built capacity with. When we engage in this work, for example, the learning walks where we go into classrooms, we pair up. So we're always pairing up folks to make sure we have iterator reliability, make sure that we have a shared understanding of what it is we're talking about, looking for. If you're the first one and the only one, and you don't have access to support, I would probably start with the resources that we provided, the briefs in this PowerPoint, and the guidebook. The guidebook is just an example of just a reflection of some of the work we've been doing to build capacity. And that's the one that's at the School Climate Transformation Grant site on PBIS.org. And if you're a coach and you have multiple schools, that district capacity building PD plan, again, this is just a PD plan. And to Susan's point, you want to wrap your system of support around this, but it does look at it linearly, so you can look at your resources. if you're one coach and you're coaching 6 schools and you're finding some commonalities across 6 schools, then pull those 6 school teams together versus, going and putting out fires. Use your data to really allocate your resources in terms of time and support. Susan mentioned Fishbowl, so we've had teams engaging with it. How do we get the teams to engage with data and develop precision statements around classroom, for example? So we've had just core coaching units come and Fishbowl watch a team do that. So we build capacity of one team, bring in others to Fishbowl and watch and reflect on that experience, which again is just looking how to be more efficient with limited resources.
Yeah, I also like this graphic because it gives you a nice kind of, to Kim's point, sorting schools by need, but also how you're going to go about installing the 8 classroom components. When we first started this work, I thought we would get through all 8 classroom components in the first year. That wasn't really the case. So as hard as we tried to install the classroom systems right alongside Tier 1 in the first couple of years of implementation, this does take some time. And so I think we've got to really be patient, again, honor the pace at which our schools can go, and really kind of listen to what it is they need and where their areas of concern are. Because sometimes their areas of concern aren't going to match the data set that you're looking at. So really making sure those focus groups are right in check with the data pieces that you're looking at. Just making sure we've answered the questions here. And Gina, hopefully we put the slide that you were looking for back on the screen. I was having trouble seeing the whole message.
The guidebook.
So I think if you look in the notes section, we have referenced the guidebook can be downloaded at PBIS.org. And if you look under the tab for School Climate Transformation Grant, you can download the guidebook. We also, I believe, in the first slide, have put our contact information. So if there's something you're struggling with, finding a resource, I don't want you to spend time kind of searching out there. We want to be able to provide it to you quickly. And there, again, is our contact information. We are with the Mid-Atlantic PBIS network at Shepherd Press, and we work all over the country, and happy to help assist with any questions you have or get you in touch with your local TA provider.
Make sure, Lori, make sure we answered. I think the spreadsheet maybe, if it's the district plan or resource mapping.
We can.
I don't have the resource mapping there, but the spreadsheet that Susan just shared, is that what you needed, Lori? Please let us know if there's something else.
We can make sure that that spreadsheet is put on the, yeah. Oh, it's right there. Yeah, it's under the School Climate tab. Again, if you have trouble finding something, just email me or email Kim, and we'll send it to you right away. Okay, what tool do you use during your classroom walkthroughs?
That's in the guidebook. And it's a tool it's very short and sweet with the 8 practices, and the same instrument that's in the guidebook. Those are on the 1-pager snapshots. For each, they're 1-page classroom snapshots. You can find those at the Mid-Atlantic PBIS.org site.
But it sounds like some folks are unclear about the guidebook. So all of the links are right here. If you just click on this tab where I have the arrow pointed, you can download all of what kind of we're describing. And again, if you have any questions about what it is you're seeing, we're happy to answer. Okay, looking at all the questions. We have finished with the questions, unless anybody wants to unmute their line. You do have access through the computer if you've got a microphone on your computer to talk to us. I'd love to hear your voice.
Okay, and Anthony, just so good with the technology. If you do want to unmute your mic, you can use the top left-hand corner of your screen. There's a microphone and icon, and you can click on the drop down to say unmute your mic.
Okay. Well, we thank you for your time. We're right up against the 2 o'clock hour, and we hope you enjoy your rest of your day. We look forward to talking with you soon.